Hey everyone, welcome to Logan's Mosh Pit. Glad to have you here. So today we're going to do another episode of the Memory Lane series, the place where we take a look back at some interesting articles and interviews from old guitar magazines. Usually we do Guitar World magazines. This time we're going to do something else. I'm going to talk about the November 2000 issue of Guitar Player magazine. I borrowed it from my dad. Here's the cover. I'm going to share an interview with you guys done by Lisa Sharkin. She talked to Billy Howerdel from the supergroup A Perfect Circle. Of course, you had the front man, Maynard James Keenan from Tool. Then on the other side, you have Billy Howerdel, the guitarist and guitar technician. You might recognize him. He's been involved with Nine Inch Nails, the Smashing Pumpkins, Guns N' Roses, Faith No More, David Bowie, Fishbone, Tool. This guy's done it all. They asked him some questions about A Perfect Circle's debut album, Mer de Noms. So let's see what he has to say. Here we go. When did you start writing your own music? The main structure for Hollow, the first track on the record, is from 1988. Brina is from about 1990. I was writing songs the whole time I was a tech. I had a Tascam 4 track, a drum machine, a bass, a guitar, a Rocktron Chameleon, and a microphone. And I wrote songs all over the world. The bands I worked for were very supportive. I learned a lot from Fishbone, for example. In working with all these big bands, I certainly saw the importance of having an identifiable sound. Who are your main influences? When I started playing at 17, Randy Rhoads was definitely my biggest influence. I learned everything he did with Ozzy by listening to the records and figuring out the parts. I also listened to the Smiths, Elvis Costello, and The Cure, but their influence on me wasn't as much about playing as it was about songwriting. But as far as technical playing, that came from Randy and Alex Lifeson. As both producer and artist, was it difficult to step aside from yourself as the musician and be objective about the material? I think the job of the producer is to have an overall sense of what the song really needs. For this record, I had to do what was appropriate for the songs. I didn't care so much about parts. I pretty much played everything on the record anyway, so I didn't have to fight for something to be heard. Basically, the way I produced this record was to listen to it. A lot. I'd do the song, bring it in the car, listen to it 5 or 6 times, and then go and revamp it. I did that over and over for years and years. Because I was teching throughout most of the writing process, it took a long time to get things down, but it was great to have that much time to really listen to the songs. I was able to gain enough perspective to hear the guitar, not just as a guitar, but how it worked within the context of the song. For example, I think that Buck Dharma, the guitarist for Blue Oyster Cult, is really good at getting the guitar to sound like another voice, rather than some cheesy Guitar Hero thing. The Cure does that too. There's just a great atmosphere without any wanking off. Of course, when I started playing, I loved the wank factor. Now there are times when I just wanted to unlearn everything I know, because I get stuck into patterns. It drives me crazy. How do you get out of those ruts? I stop playing and listen to the songs, but I don't dare try to figure out songs I really like. Because once you start thinking about the chords and the notes, the magic of the song is ruined. What was your setup for Mer de Noms? I used one guitar, one head, one cabinet, and one mic. The guitar was a 1960 Gibson Les Paul Classic with Tom Anderson pickups that are very biting. I put a 3+ in the bridge and a 1- in the neck. That guitar went straight into the Marshall in a VHT 4x12 cabinet with Celestion Vintage 30s. To mic the cab, I just used a Shure SM57. I wound up playing Les Pauls almost exclusively because in teching for people, I obviously played and worked on a lot of guitars, and the Pauls proved to be the best made instruments. The amp is actually a 100 watt Marshall JMP series super lead from around 1978, but it has a Naylor preamp in it, so the front end is totally different from a stock Marshall. It has a very interesting sound because it's extremely bright and extremely dark at the same time, which is pleasing to me. A lot of amps have this sizzling, buzzy high end, but this amp has just the right amount of cut and bite without being fuzzy and buzzy. What I really like about the Naylor preamp is that it cleans up better than any amp I've ever heard. I think that's the sign of a good amp. Dave Friedman at Rack Systems in Hollywood did the mod for me. I also had Dave build me some amps from scratch. He duplicated every part in the modded Marshall with new parts. It's a 2-channel amp, dirty and dirtier, with an effects loop. That's all I'm using live. I used the Tube Screamer setting on a Lexicon MPX G2. It also has excellent octave fuzz, MXR Phase 90, and flanger settings. I'd challenge anybody to pit the G2 against the real units and tell the difference. Pedals are a big part of my sound, but now everything is inside the G2. The unit definitely cut down the amount of gear in my rack. Did you record with effects or add them in the mix? The stomp box type effects you hear came from the Lexicon MPX G2, and the mix effects were mostly TDM plugins for Pro Tools. I actually started recording the songs with a couple of guitars and delay, but I found that effects can sometimes be really cheesy when you're trying to achieve a huge sound. The most natural way to get the biggest sound seemed to be layering. There definitely seems to be a lot of layering on the album. It depends on the song. Judith has something like 24 guitar tracks, 8 rhythm parts, and 16 guitars doing the exact same thing for the slide lines. I once read that Randy Rhoads used to triple track everything, so I thought, why not do 16 tracks? Do you use any unusual tunings on the album? For most of the parts, I tuned down 3 half steps to C sharp. How do you set up your guitars to accommodate the low tuning? I use Ernie Ball .013-.056 gauge strings, but because I tune down, they don't seem as heavy as you'd think. I normally use .011-.052 for standard tuning. I set my guitars to 3/64 on the high E string at the 12th fret and about 3/64 on the low E string. My action is set pretty low, but I'm starting to bring it a little higher now because it's too hard to dig in when I'm playing slide. Who influenced your slide technique? Probably Joe Walsh. I was a big fan of his when I was a kid, but I had never picked up a slide until I wrote Judith. I just happened to have one lying around that day, and it inspired me to write that song. I use a Dunlop glass slide with a bevel. It's a full finger slide, and I use it on my ring finger with the big end up. How would you describe your approach to sculpting guitar sounds? I'm definitely not scared to use a ton of effects, but I try to use them within reason. It definitely depends on the parts, but I go through the whole range, from completely naked to hiding behind really lush effects. I always want to hit a note and make it memorable, an explosion of sound. The Cocteau Twins have been a huge influence on me for those kinds of ambient pads. Conversely, my main dirty rhythm sound is thin and biting. Are effects an essential part of your songwriting process as well? My songwriting is inspired by effects more than notes. The process definitely starts with the sound, like a bass with a ton of effects on it. Elvis Costello supposedly said that when he gets writer's block, he'll play a left-handed fretless bass upside down in the dark. That's an extreme approach, but it's kind of how I use effects, to start a path to something interesting. So that takes us to the end of the article. It was cool, especially for guitar players like me, to hear what kind of gear and effects he used. If you know the gear and effects, it helps you recreate the unique tone you hear. So that does it for today's video, guys. I hope you enjoyed. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe if you haven't already. I really appreciate the support. I'll see you next time. Until then, rock on.